After almost a year, I finally decided to paint terrain. Greetings and welcome to Mediocre Minis. Recently, I was going through my office and I stumbled over the Kill Team 3rd Edition launch box, Hivestorm more specifically, and I realized I started painting some of these models, but I never actually got around to finishing it. I figured it was high time not only to get some of these things painted, but to, well, actually play some Kill Team. So let's take a look at some of the equipment. These are items that you can choose during the game itself, but that's not important right now. Let's take a look at some of it. First off, with what I think is some of the coolest looking pieces, the communication devices. One thing that I decided to do was put most of this terrain or this equipment onto bases. The reason for that is it'll be a lot sturdier and easier to store and play with if it is mounted onto a base. So I turned to my mini factory, more specifically IOL Minis. It's basically a collection of basic standard bases at different sizes. I'll link them down below, but I paid for them, and I'll tell you what, I'll probably always have a nice selection of bases. Most of these terrain pieces I'm putting on 25mm bases to keep them small, as distances and size of base really does matter in Kill Team. Anyway, after I mounted the communication devices to the printed bases, I then added in some texture paste. This brown earth paste is from Vallejo, and it mostly I put on there to give a little bit of texture and to give some variation to the base itself. Once the texture paste dried, I then moved on to the priming, and since I already had magnets on the bases, it made putting all of the bits onto a piece of old curtain rod pretty easy. And I just took them outside and used a rattle can of matte black by the Army Painter. And with the primer dried, it's now time to paint. One thing to keep in mind, there are actually two devices that I am painting at the same time. So I will go back and forth footage-wise between the two. But just keep in mind they're the same device, just a little bit of variation with the paint. So for the paint job, for some reason I decided to base coat everything in silver, more specifically gunmetal by Vallejo Model Metallic Air. I'm not sure why I did this first. I think it's because I thought, well, eventually I want to have some chipping and weathering effects. Why not start with that? It didn't work out too well. Anyway, then I decided to, well, of course, rebase coat it with Camo Green by Proacryl. After this dried, it was then time to do all of the little bits and pieces of these devices. And for this, I will start with, well, the radar screen. So for the radar screen, I began with Black Green by Proacryl. And once that was dry, the hard part began. I wanted these screens to look like, well, radar in some instance. And to do that, I just used Moot Green by Citadel. And with a very sharp point on my brush, I made many attempts to draw lines on these small screens. It probably took me 4 or 5 tries easily for each of these to get correct or to get to what I kind of wanted to look like. For instance, in one, I tried to draw just a simple X and then a circle. It was a pain to draw a basic circle on something so small. And what I found that actually worked for me was drawing 4 90-degree arcs. So just 4 arcs that I just happened to connect, and that actually worked a heck of a lot easier. Next part, we move on to the gauge that's right off to the left. Now, I did this 2 different ways. One way, I simply made it look like a few lines on a background of white, and that was fine. But for the second time, I decided to separate it with a little bit of color. I took green, orange, and a type of minty green and put that as the background for this gauge. And then I finished up with the actual dial with red. This actually took a pretty long time. An easy way to paint something like this is to be a little bit messy. Don't worry so much about getting the sides and having to refix up the green. It's not that big of a deal. Be a little bit messy, and you can always go back in and touch up all of the mistakes later on. Very, very quick and easy, and a lot simpler to do it this way of making a mess and then fixing it, as opposed to very tight precision in such a small gap. After that, there is all of the buttons and knobs. I went a few different ways with these. I kind of used a few different paints based on what I had on my palette. I used some blacks, I kind of mixed things up, some red and some blues on some of the larger buttons. I didn't want them to stand out too much, and I know they look a little bit bright right now, but we do tone them down. But any color you have on your palette can work as well for a button, for whatever reason or design you might have in mind. And then on to the back. There's a few interesting bits and bobs in the back as well. For instance, there are a few what look like buttons and wires, and then I just very delicately base coated those in red or blue respectively. And of course a little bit of off-white for what the plug or the part of the plug is that is shown on the back as well. I moved over to a panel liner. This is a product made by Tamiya, and this stuff is the best. Like seriously, it's the best. It's wonderful. It's great, and it's the best. With a simple tap of different areas, the panel liner works really, really well. Fills in all of those nooks and crannies, and really kind of gets in there to really show some really good contrast on different areas in the model. I also ran this all over the silver bits of the antenna and dish. It gave just a little bit of a grimy, dirty, grungy look, and honestly, I was really happy with how it looked when I just put it all over those aspects of the model. And finally, before I moved on, I gave everything a black wash. Now, there was a few areas I didn't want to be washed over or tinted in any way, such as, for instance, the radar screen. I wanted that to stay the way it was, so I was careful to wash around that area or any other bits and bobs that I didn't want to have changed over by the black wash. And finally, with that completed, I moved on to the boxes and other basing bits and, well, the base itself. I based these bits in either dark neutral gray or a black and brown, again by Pro Acryl, just to give some variation and what would be kind of a military-esque box. And once all that was dry, then I decided to add some decals. I've never really worked with decals before, and I know this is kind of an odd thing to add randomly, but some of these boxes have some really large open areas that would really benefit from some form of decoration or design. So I went through all the transfer sheets that I have and came across, well, some of the Sisters of Battle. They look cool, so that's what I'm going with. Nothing more to it than that. I didn't have any Imperial Guard, so we go with the Sisters. One of the communicators, I add in a logo from the Order of the Valerius Heart, and on the other one, I simply added just a fleur-de-lis on it. There's really no rhyme or reason other than they look cool. And to get the transfers to work, I simply took a cap and put some water in it, used a X-Acto knife or my hobby knife to trim out the decal itself, and set that into the water for it to loosen up. And while that is in the water for the miniature itself, I took a brush and applied some Micro Set. This is a decal solution that helps out with setting and softening decals and get them to apply easier. Once decal was free from the paper, I rather used a brush, a toothpick, a piece of silicone, anything. It really kind of moved off pretty easily. And then applied it directly on top of the miniature where I would like it. And using a trick I learned from Midwinter Minis in one of his videos, taking a toothpick to poke it around and move the decal into a spot where I would want it to be. This took a few moments as well, and surprisingly the toothpick was great. I would definitely recommend using that to position and move around decals if you have a little bit of trouble with them. And then of course I let the decal set overnight. I really wanted that to dry and stick to the surface relatively well. I didn't want them to rub off later on when I began to paint over top of them. Oh, speaking of which, the first paint I put over top of them wasn't a paint at all. It was more of a varnish. The decals are very shiny to start off with. It's just the way the transfer paper works. So I applied a thin layer of matte varnish by AK to tone that down and get it to blend in with the rest of the model. And once the varnish was dry, then it was time for the weathering. And this is where a lot of fun took place. For the weathering, I used a piece of packing foam sponge. This is just foam that you use to protect or transfer anything around. Miniatures, objects, electronics sometimes have this foam. I just pluck off a piece and dip it into some paint and dab it all over. Started off with black and just dabbed it all over the model in different areas where there would be chipping or rubbing or places where the paint would fall off. But once that was dry, then I went to the gunmetal, that's silver once again, and then I dabbed that on to show, well, some places the primer chipped away and the bare metal was showing. Again, focusing on corners and edges, using both a brush for some delicate detailed work and also the sponge for some splotchy all-around chipping. And then once all of that was complete, there was a little bit left that I wanted to do on the boxes of the model itself before I moved on to the remainder of the base, and that was to make it look even dirtier. And this was taking a leather brown or a dark brown. I eventually used this as part of the base as well, but took some of that paint and thinned it down and did a little bit of splotchy work on it. Some of the corners and bottoms of, say, the boxes and the devices itself, it just seemed like there's dirt and grime. Things got dirty in these areas. Maybe there's mud that caked on, or areas that are starting to rust. Oh, speaking of rust, we can do some of that as well by using an orangey brown. Some super thin orange brown, and splotch that on just as in the same manner as with the brown. Kind of shows some beginnings of some general rust and some wear and some corrosion and some decay on some of the metal bits. Finally, we have the base itself. I used a combination of greens, grays, browns, and kind of slopped it all over the base. I didn't have any real rhyme or reason. I just wanted a variety of tones and a variety of colors covering the texture paste and some of the rocks. And once that was dry, I then finished up the base with a few grass tufts and a black base run. And there you have it, 2 communication devices complete. It's a little bit over the top for what is effectively equipment that you might not even need, or terrain pieces that aren't even really the models you move around the board. But they were a lot of fun to paint. Some really interesting details and some areas where you can just kind of have fun and see what worked and paint things and do things however you wanted. I overall kind of enjoy painting it. What do you think? Do you have little bits and bobs and terrain pieces that you work on? Do you like painting them? Do you hate painting them? Let me know down below. Thanks again for watching. This is Mediocre Minis, and may the divine light your path.